Today we visit the International Policy Research Center of Havana to talk with Santiago Perez, researcher and deputy director of this institution. We will talk about the political and commercial relationship between Cuba and the Russian Federation. Santiago is the head of the National International Relations Research Program, and he has been a researcher at the Center for Studies on America in Havana and a professor at Cuban Institute of International Affairs. He completed postgraduate studies at the Autonomous University of Mexico and has been a professor and researcher at the Ibero-American University of Mexico, Harvard University, Columbia, Lomonosov University of Moscow, among others. He has published on Russian and Soviet politics, U.S. projections, and Cuba's foreign policy. With Santiago Perez, we have the pleasure to talk today in From Havana. Well, thank you so much for agreeing to do this interview. It's a pleasure for us and a really enlightenment to know about your opinion on such important theme as the presence of Russia in Cuba and in the economical and social impact that it has for a country. First of all, the Prime Minister of the Russian Republic, Dmitry Medvedev, just came to Cuba in an official visit a few days ago. Tell me, what's the context that this visit took place here in Cuba, the Cuban context, national and international context that it took place, that visit?
Well, thank you for interviewing me and giving me the possibility of talking to your audience. I think that the visit of Medvedev is within the context of contradictions between Russia and the U.S., in general Russia and the West, following after the Ukrainian crisis 2014 and all the sanctions that have been imposed on Russia in general by the West. On the other hand, you have the U.S. relations with Russia, which are worsening despite Trump's exclamations on Putin, etc. And for sure, the whole hostility of the U.S. administration against Cuba. So we are here in a context of the sanctions against Russia, sanctions against Cuba. Cuba has the upper hand on that. Cuba has 60 years of sanctions. The Russians have around 5 years. So we are in the context of growing contradictions at the level of big powers and at the level of Latin America versus the U.S. Remember that the Americans are claiming again that they are following the Monroe Doctrine, yes, which means the extraterritorial powers are not allowed to Latin America. The president of Medvedev is breaking that principle of the U.S., of the so-called U.S. foreign policy, which from my perspective is nonsense. And the Chinese are here, the Europeans are here, the Russians are here. But yes, the context is very important on development of relations between Cuba and Russia.
So in that line, you don't think that this new, let's say, wave of agreements with both Cuba and Venezuela by the Russians are like a way to show strength and to show a position of strength against the United?
Yeah, to a certain extent, yes, but I would say that Russia and Cuba has their own logic of its developments. Russia and Venezuela has also its own logic of development of relations. I mean, not everything is being explained through the lenses of the opposition to the U.S. I think that their interests emanating from the Russian political actors, from the Russian economic actors which are interested in relations with Cuba, especially in relations with Venezuela due to the fact of all the resources that Venezuela has and the scope of its market and its importance in terms of economics. And in the case of Cuba, also out of economic considerations in terms of a market for exporting their manufactured products. But I wouldn't underline the level of friendship, the level of mutual understanding between Russia and Cuban leadership that are important. I would say the base for that, the flourishing of the relations. And also the coincidence in general foreign policy approaches. I found it interesting that when Medvedev was explaining or making his speech in front of Mr. Diaz-Canel in the Palace of the Revolution, he said that the issue of sovereignty, the issue of national determination was also a part of the intrinsic part of the Russian foreign policy, of the Russian nature as state. So here we are a lot of coincidences, more than the pragmatic interests, which I think are there, but it's also important, I would say, the philosophical perception of different angles of this relationship.
Early this morning, I heard a researcher, a Venezuelan researcher, saying that the United States has not does not an invasion, a direct invasion on Venezuela, because they don't know how much are Russia in Venezuela, the cooperation. How big is the cooperation with Venezuela? Is this true? I mean, does Russia has anything to do directly or not directly in the fact that the United States has not troops in Venezuela?
Well, you know, I think that the U.S. has made their analysis of cost and benefits and a possible military move in Venezuela. I would say that one of the variables they take into consideration is the level of involvement of the Russians. I don't think it's too high or so high to avoid any military action from the Pentagon if they wish to. I think that the most important deterrent for the U.S. military possible or foreseeable U.S. intervention is the strength of the Venezuelan resistance, is the strength of the unity of the patriotic forces in Venezuela, is the strength of the Venezuelan army and the Venezuelan militia, because you can bomb, okay, then what's next? What are you going to do down there? Look, they have been for 18 years in Afghanistan. They have to get out from Afghanistan because they have having a lot of problems there. I wouldn't imagine a U.S. invasion full scale into Venezuela. So my answer to your point is, or to that perspective of the Venezuelan observer you mentioned, is that yes, that's one of the aspects to take into account when the Russian weaponry being sold to Venezuela. It's sophisticated, it's airplanes, it's important fighters, it's important weaponry, anti-missiles, etc., etc. But I would say that most important is the will to resistance of Venezuelan leadership, Venezuelan army, and Venezuela patriotic forces in the people of Venezuela.
It's a civic and military.
I would say, yeah. I would, yeah.
Now and then.
I mean, the Russians are important, but they are not the ones who are calling the shots, I would say.
Okay. Coming back to Cuba, now and then, which is the difference between the collaborations between these two countries, Russia and Cuba, in the 70s and the 80s, with before the falling of the Communist Party, of the Communist.
I always say that Vladimir Vladimirovich Putin is not Leonid Ilyich Brezhnev. Okay. So Russia is not the Soviet Union, it's a capitalist country, it's the capitalist foreign power, and so there is no such ideological link or brotherhood, let's say, that existed before. Now there are different approaches in terms of the internal policies of Russia and of Cuba. That doesn't mean there is still there, and it's growing with every year, the friendship.
Of course.
Between Cuban people, Russian people, and Cuban government and Russian government. It has not been always that way. There have been problems in the relationship.
Like all relationships?
Yeah, like with any country of Cuba and modern Russia, let's say, or capitalist Russia. But judging from the visit of Raúl Castro in 2009 till now, the relationship are growing and it's becoming very, very friendly. There are a lot of interest from both sides. In the case of Russia, it's important the existence of Cuba, its multilateral activism. It's important the trust. Medvedev have been saying that all the time in Cuba, that Cuba is a trusted ally, which is very important. Russia doesn't have too many allies whom they can trust the way they trust Cuba. So it's important, irrespective of the nature of your internal political regime or internal socioeconomic structure, to have friends who have been loyal to you in the world. And an important friend like Cuba in Latin America or in multilateral fora is important. Also, the economic interest I've been mentioning to you in terms of a market for selling their manufactured products, in terms of future possible oil.
That's very important.
That could be found in Cuba. The interest for modernizing Cuban infrastructure. We're talking about pragmatic considerations in terms of capital gains, in terms of mutual interest. It's not like it was before, when they were given credits, when they were being bought, for example, sugar at other prices according to the world market. So this relationship is very friendly, it's a very principled relationship, but it's different than it used to be. Cuba, for example, is paying the debt. With the Russian Federation.
10% of the main debt.
Well, no, the Russian abolished the debt we had with
the 90%,
them.
I think they put
they put in during his visit, and in 2014 he abolished that part of the debt. But the rest of the debt has been paying to the Russian Federation, and Dmitry Medvedev acknowledged that the Cubans were paying the debt, the interest, etc. For Cuba, is strategic, the relationship with Russia, because Cuba's small country in front of this huge animal, the U.S., needs that relationship with Russia, with China, who respect Cuba, who doesn't. None of them, none of them, but a lot of countries in the world, but specifically Russia, respects the sovereignty of Cuba, doesn't interfere in its internal affairs. You know, it's very important. Mutual respect, real mutual respect. You know, the Russian embassy is not meddling here in trying to make regime change in the easy way. So Russia is not on that. And it's becoming important because they are saying that they want to support Cuba. They have been making investments.
Yes.
They have very important commercial turnaround.
We signed up 8 agreements, 8 understanding agreements.
During the visit of Medvedev, there were signed 8 agreements, but there are a lot of projects. If you look, for example, in terms of transport, we're talking about investments of around $1 billion in railroads, infrastructures, in railroads, cars. We have huge investment in car industry. So it's very complex, the relationship, and the fact that the Russians are saying, okay, we are putting our shoulder, we are supporting Cuba in front of that hostility is important, but based on mutual interest. I would say that that's the difference, but for Cuba is okay.
As I was saying,
oil, energy.
Understood.
Okay, yeah.
But in the mobility infrastructure, the transportation and oil, which is maybe right now the most important part of all this agreement, Trump is heading his last period of this administration. His last year could be his last year. We don't know. Do you think, as an observer, that Trump has the possibility of a second term? Does the American people looks to the foreign policy or the internal policy when they go to the polls? Do you think he has a second term?
The Americans don't care too much about the world, right? If they want to go to the beach, they go to Miami. If they want to go to Asia, they go to California. So if they want to go to the north, or they go to Canada, or to their northern border. The U.S., as big countries, are very concentrated in its internal and domestic issues. I wouldn't deny the possibility of his re-election. I wouldn't deny the possibility of his impeachment. I wouldn't deny the possibility of Joe Biden to become a U.S. president next elections, because the U.S. is unpredictable. That's a problem dealing with them. That's the difference with the Russians, for example. You are predicting in geopolitical terms that Russia is going to be stable, that the country is developing. It has its economic problems, okay? We don't have to deny that.
It's a big nation also.
It's a big nation with contradictions, but there is stability. And the fact that they have been, as we were talking about, investing, for example, in possible oil drilling in Cuba. Medvedev inaugurated one of the oil drills here. It's a huge message. Also, in terms of the refineries in Cuba, possible business to be developed on that, and the reparation, the fixing of thermoelectrics. We are talking about billion euros also in those projects. So Cuba, as a country which is under siege, looks for the world and has to have relations on a solid, on a strategic base. Cubans talk about 2013 plan, and that the Russians are welcome to take part in that. Also the Europeans, also Chinese, also Latin American investors. So Cuba is very open on that.
I think that's smart because, I mean, let's say in this worst case scenario, Trump comes again, second term. There's 4 more years with Trump. And it's been historically, the last years of the administrations have come with changes. Good changes with Obama, for example. His last years, he made the defrost. But with Trump, it could go to worse.
Yeah, that's one of my worries, that Trump has done almost nothing in terms of achievements in foreign policy. What has he done? He has talking to North Koreans, but there are a lot of problems there. He has problems with Iran, problems with Russia. He has deteriorated our relationship with China. So my worry is that one of his legacies he would like to have after he finishes his stay in the White House would be maybe to get rid of socialism, as he calls in Latin America, and that's very, very dangerous.
He has said it publicly, actually.
I mean, yeah, he is against that, but thinking in 4 years term, right? One of his legacies, the legacy of Obama, was to restore relationship with Cuba, and the history is going to remember him for that. I'm afraid that he would say, okay, one of my legacy was to get rid of socialism in Venezuela and Cuba. That's very, very worried. That will be a catastrophe. But I wouldn't deny also the slight possibility of a little bit of softening the approach towards Cuba, in the sense, not most to Venezuela, but maybe to Cuba, in the sense that the same forces that were in favor of economic relations, of investments in Cuba, the cruise companies, the airplanes, could influence his side of businessman, right?
Russia again.
Yeah.
It would go. I mean, do you think there are bigger plans between both countries? This just 8 agreements right now, but do you think it was publicly the President Miguel Díaz-Canel invited Putin to come to Cuba in person? Maybe next year he can come to Cuba. Do you think this is just a first step to go into something bigger in terms of relationships and investments and development?
I think that there is an ongoing relationship, right? Remember that relations with Russia at this level, I would say, were inaugurated when Raúl visited them in 2009. Prior to that, there was a process of becoming friendly as used before, but with caution.
It's a different political system.
Completely. So the relationship, if you analyze that from the chronological perspective, there has been a growing in momentum in that relationship. I would say that now it's the best state of relationship. Mr. Diaz-Canel said that he would go to Moscow maybe at the end of this month because he's going to Baku to the non-aligned movement summit. He's passing by Moscow. Putin invited him when he was last year there in November to visit Moscow with the anniversary of the victory over fascism. He's going to be there. He invited Vladimir Vladimirovich, as the Russians call him, to come to Cuba. He was here in July 2014, Putin.
Yes, I
know. Well, one point I wanted to make, this visit of Mr. Medvedev, it's been prepared for a long way, right? There was the Intergovernmental Summit in Moscow in September, the 20th of September, was Vice President Cabrizas, Vice Prime Minister Borisov there, Vice President of Vice Prime Minister Mr. Cabrizas and Borisov, and they signed also a lot of agreements. They signed, for example, a very important one, which is a roadmap for developing energy cooperation between Cuba and Russia. That may be some shipments of oil, maybe to Cuba, maybe in general in the energy projects. I already mentioned that. There is also the possibility of agriculture cooperation. Hey, Cuba is buying wheat from Canada or France. Why not from Russia? Russia is becoming one of the first exporters of wheat in the world, the same with oil, right?
Just to close this interview, I would like to know, in your opinion, where is Latin America going in the next 2 years? This is a hard question.
No, it's very interesting question. I think that Latin America is feeling the close ally of neoliberalism. Look, they had a lot of problems with neoliberalism at the late 90s. So there was the tide of progressive governments in Brazil, Argentina, Uruguay, Bolivia, Venezuela, etc. My bet, as answering to your question, is that Latin America has to take back the path of integration among themselves, of looking for alternatives. Russia is one alternative, China, European Union countries, all of them are resisting the sanctions and the hostility of the US, which are saying, okay, Latin America is mine, right? So Latin America has to go other way because it's not just bringing results. That close relationship with the US. And look, for example, they wanted to invade, or at least military operations, Venezuela, and Lima Group, which is very pro-US, but when they talk about invading Venezuela, that's another thing. Look what's happening in Ecuador today with neoliberalism being imposed by Lenin Moreno. So I cannot tell you, I don't have the crystal ball, even though in my center we make scenarios on different areas. But what I'm telling you is that neoliberalism, or things that used to be in the 80s, don't have a way out in Latin America. People deserve better.
Well, thank you so much. It's been delightful to talk about this. Very enlightenment. Thank you so much for this opportunity.
Thank you and your audience.